It is the fall of 1975, and Washington carries the smell of wet leaves and hot microphones. Down the marbled halls of the Capitol, 10 senior United States senators from the Aeronautical and Space Sciences Committee call the country's best aviation minds to a long, polished table. The oil shock of 1973 has not faded. It has settled like a weight on the shoulders of an industry that once seemed invincible. The hearing room fills with the familiar names of flight and power: United Airlines, Boeing, Pratt & Whitney, General Electric, alongside sober, uniformed officials from NASA and the US Air Force, and representatives of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. One by one they take the oath, clear their throats, and place, like offerings, charts and statements before the senators. What follows is not the usual swagger of an industry built on speed and confidence. Instead, the testimony lands in somber phrases that everyone in the room understands at once: immediate crisis condition, long-range trouble, serious danger, economic dislocation. The numbers are simple, unforgiving, and utterly cold. A barrel of oil that once cost $2.59 now demands $11.65. A gallon of gasoline creeps from 38.5 cents to 55.1 cents. Households know the pinch at the pump. Commuters have formed new habits around scarcity. But for commercial aviation, the problem multiplies by fleets, by schedules, by the ton. The companies furloughed more than 25,000 workers in January 1974. Pan American, giant of the American sky, pulls out of a dozen cities in a single, painful pruning. The president of United Airlines puts words to what the room already feels. The industry's economic vitality is draining away. There is a hush that comes with math like this: oil, fuel of factories, navies, and everyday life, has become a lever moved by distant hands. Reserves are concentrated elsewhere. Moods sway with the length of gas lines and the size of each week's bill. Politicians sense the tremor in their districts. Families sense it in their routines. And yet, in the quiet center of the storm, a different current stirs: the instinct of engineers to solve practical problems under pressure. The hearing, with its bleak forecasts, does not simply document a crisis, it lights a fuse. At NASA, clusters of scientists and engineers begin to reshape their whiteboards. They sketch not high-compression dreams of record-setting altitudes, but careful pathways to use less fuel. One planning exercise becomes 2, then 6, then a portfolio of ideas bold enough to be called unlikely and sober enough to be taken seriously. Soon a vision emerges, a suite of advanced aeronautical programs that, if executed properly, might cut the fuel burned by American commercial and military aircraft by as much as half. The price tag is not small: a decade, $500 million, and all the patience that large-scale research and development demands. But the senators who heard the dismal testimony are in no mood for cautious half measures. This is not a time, they insist, to allow promising technology to lie fallow. And so a new effort receives its name, clean and functional as a drawn wing: the Aircraft Energy Efficiency Project, ACE. The 1970s energy crisis marks a hinge in the long door of American aviation. Since 1915, back when NASA was the NACA, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the essential story had been a ladder. Climb higher, fly faster, go farther. Those were ideals that left contrails across a century. They made good copy, set records, and fit beautifully into the drama of pilots, prototypes, and national pride. Higher, faster, farther felt like destiny rather than an option. Young engineers glued to textbooks and wind tunnel photos did not dream of saving kerosene. Fuel was plentiful and cheap. Efficiency, at least in the public imagination, was not the stuff of posters. One project captures that earlier era's spirit: the quest for a supersonic civil airliner. After the military proved it could break the sound barrier, planners for commercial travel looked across the fence and imagined the same concept for business and leisure. The Supersonic Transport, or SST, made headlines and inspired models on office shelves. But the American effort proved ill-starred and, under the pressure of cost, controversy, and technology not yet ready for prime time, was cancelled in 1971. The cancellation closed a chapter. 2 years later, the oil embargo opened another. After 1973, the mantra of higher, faster, farther begins to step aside for new words: conservation and efficiency. They sound less glamorous, but in the mid-1970s they carry the urgency of keeping a system alive. In 1976, funding for ACE begins to flow in earnest, and the work starts. Practical, incremental in places, visionary in others. The program takes a split form across NASA's centers, each piece aimed at a different part of the aircraft's appetite for fuel. The logic is simple: squeeze more performance from engines, lighten and streamline the airframe, and keep the airflow smooth where it counts most. 3 of the 6 projects cluster at what was then the Lewis Research Center in Cleveland, now known as Glenn Research Center. The first, Engine Component Improvement, is a study in disciplined pragmatism, incremental upgrades to existing turbine engines that, part by part, erode in efficiency. The second, the Energy Efficient Engine, known by its shorthand E3, aims higher. Rather than patch an old design, it nurtures an entirely new class of jet engine, optimized from the first sketch onward for better fuel economy than what the airline industry currently flies. The third, and the one that raises the most eyebrows, is the Advanced Turboprop project. It proposes, in a jet age defined by smooth nacelles and swept wings, to return to propellers, though not old ones. These are advanced, finely sculpted, and tuned to sip fuel while pushing aircraft at impressive speeds. They sacrifice a bit of reach and dash compared to pure jets, but the payoff in fuel consumption could be startling. Of the Lewis projects, this is both the riskiest and, in the arithmetic of gallons burned, the most powerful. Meanwhile, at Langley Research Center in Virginia, 3 complementary efforts take form. Energy-efficient transport focuses on aerodynamics and active flight controls to shave drag and refine how an aircraft moves through the air from takeoff to landing. Composite primary aircraft structures opens the door to materials that are light, strong, and stubbornly resistant to corrosion. Fiberglass reinforced plastics, graphite composites, so that metal gives way where it can and weight drops where it matters. The third, Laminar flow control, sounds modest but is nothing of the sort. It pursues smoother airflow over wings and other surfaces, holding back the tendency of air to turn turbulent and draggy. The prize is significant. The path is hard. Many in the field consider it nearly impossible to achieve in real service, on real aircraft, with real weather. Langley takes the risk anyway. Like the Advanced Turboprop at Lewis, Laminar flow control promises the largest single bite out of fuel burn if it can be made to work reliably. Behind these projects lies a philosophy of research as deliberate as any blueprint. NASA runs 2 streams side by side. One is base research, fundamental work in concepts, materials, analysis, and early testing. Base programs do not aim to produce a product tomorrow, they aim to make tomorrow possible. The other stream is focused R&D, the stage for full-scale demonstrations and the kind of integration that moves a technology out of the lab and towards certification and use. ACE takes shape as a focused program, drawing strength from base efforts already germinating across the field. Ideas like laminar flow, winglets, and supercritical wings that had proven themselves in principle and now needed the financial and organizational muscle to grow to full size. An obvious problem hovers over the whole enterprise. Commercial aviation is not only a triumph of engineering, it is an ecosystem of risk management. Airlines and manufacturers are, by necessity, cautious. They work with narrow margins and deep responsibilities to safety. Radical reinvention is rare, and for good reason. But the fuel crisis loosens old habits. Fear sharpens vision. Possibilities once brushed aside as too much too soon receive a second hearing. As Donald Norred, who directed the trio of ACE projects at Lewis, observed, the climate was making people attempt things they would ordinarily be too conservative to try. The advanced turboprop embodies that shift, a technology bold enough to challenge the dominance of the turbojet. And at Langley, laminar flow control pushes at the boundary of what textbooks and lab tests suggest might be doable, attempting to tame airflow at commercial scale. Government's role in this moment is not incidental, it is decisive. With industry's encouragement, NASA is asked to shoulder risks that the private sector, left alone, would likely decline. The funding arrives, the charter is clear, and the work grows roots. ACE is, in this way, a test not merely of machines but of institutions, of whether a government laboratory can align itself with industry, quicken the pace of technology, and deliver benefits measured not in headlines but in gallons saved and routes sustained. As the projects advance, they generate a blizzard of technical papers, reports, and test data. Yet curiously, the historical record, stories that step back and place ACE within the broader sweep of culture, politics, and economics, remains thin. The program tends to appear in footnotes as a side plot to bigger tales of satellites and space shuttles. One notable exception is the work of Virginia P. Dawson and Mark D. Bowles, who in the late 1990s examined the advanced turboprop in the context of how radical ideas can be nurtured in conservative environments. Their study lights a path for a fuller accounting of what ACE attempted and, in many arenas, achieved. Other works too trace pieces of the story. For the Lewis projects, Roy Hager and Deborah Vrabel compile a detailed narrative of the advanced turboprop, and Carl C. Kipler documents what the energy-efficient engine accomplished and where it fell short. At Langley, Marvin B. Dow reviews Composites research and how it moved from concept to primary aircraft structures. David B. Middleton assembles a program summary of energy-efficient transport. Albert L. Braslow chronicles laminar flow control with the patience it demands. Jeffrey L. Ethel provides a wide-angle technical overview of fuel economy across aviation, with ACE threaded through the discussion. And then there is the sheer volume of primary documentation. By 1987, a bibliography for Composites work alone runs to more than 600 entries, an entire small library just to catalogue one of the 6 ACE programs. These documents, valuable as they are, focus mostly on the progression of technical ideas and the lessons pulled from wind tunnels, test stands, and flight trials. They were often written while the program still ran hot or in the years immediately after the last checks were cut. What is rarer is a narrative that treats ACE not only as an engineering campaign, but as a human and institutional story. Why this moment mattered, how it connected to the American public, and how decisions shaped outcomes. A later monograph, aptly titled The Apollo of Aeronautics, promises to do just that, drop ACE into its wider frame, past the spreadsheets, into the world that made those spreadsheets meaningful. If one asks why ACE deserves that broader treatment, there are several answers, each a chapter in its own right. The first is simple. Results. Many of the 6 projects delivered tangible improvements that, once matured and adopted, helped the industry fly more passengers to more places with less fuel. One can measure the success in percentages. By the end of the 1990s, estimates suggest that aircraft energy efficiency improved on the order of 3 to 4% per year over a span of decades. Put more plainly, the world's airlines were using roughly half the fuel to carry a passenger a given distance compared with the mid-1970s. That figure does not belong to AC alone. Many currents shape technological progress, but AC acted as an enabler and a catalyst. It lowered barriers, sped development, and helped promising ideas survive long enough to prove themselves in service. A second reason to study AC closely is what it reveals about technology transfer, how ideas move from lab benches and government centres into the fleets and balance sheets of civil industry. From its first page, ACE is built as a partnership. NASA coordinates and funds, industry designs and tests, and both sides calibrate ambitions against constraints. The agency's value here is to assume outsized risks on projects that could be too expensive and too uncertain for a company to carry alone. In doing so, NASA reconnects with its first name, the A that stood for Aeronautics, long before the rockets took center stage. After the moon landings, as the public gaze tilted skyward less often, ACE signals a turn earthward, toward conservation, sustainability, and the quotidian miracle of making air travel reliable and affordable in a world of finite resources. It also illustrates the strength of the focused R&D model, when the goal is to shepherd base research into mature, deployable technology, less a scatter of small projects and more a coordinated push toward outcomes the entire system can feel. As you drift with this story through the corridors of policy and the quiet hum of wind tunnels, if you'd like more journeys like this, unhurried explorations of aerospace that you can fall asleep to, take a moment to subscribe to and like Space Historian. It helps keep these calm voyages coming without breaking the spell. A third answer lies in the perennial question of creativity and how institutions handle it. The advanced turboprop case is a lens for that conversation. Historian Thomas Hughes has argued that the large research and development structures of the 20th century, whether government agencies, corporate laboratories, or universities, tend to dampen the spark of radical invention. Organizations, he suggests, prefer the steady predictability of the old status quo, or the quick comfort of a new one. By contrast, he casts the late 19th century as a golden time for independent inventors, free to tinker and leap without committee meetings. That is one story, and it resonates. Yet historian David Hounshaw counters that picture, pointing out that industrial research laboratories can, in fact, nurture creativity rather than smother it. Talented individuals placed within well-designed teams and given clear goals may achieve more together than each could manage alone. A lab in this view is not a cage but an amplifier, an arrangement of people, tools and habits that multiplies capability. AC fits this second framing as comfortably as a wing in its route. What comes through, reading its history, is less the triumph of a lone genius and more the performance of an organization tuned to foster difficult innovations. The program's architecture, focused funding, cross-center collaboration, industrial contracts, a clear mandate from Congress, creates a scaffolding strong enough to hold big risks and patient enough to see them through. Across Langley and Lewis, the projects interlock. Engineers share data and lessons. Managers shuffle resources toward what shows promise. Test pilots translate insight into flight. It is a choreography that moves not with the speed of a startup, but with the steadiness of an institution that knows what it means to fly at scale and assume responsibility for public trust. If one wants finally to understand what made ACE unique, it may be this: the sheer complexity of its web. This was not a single lab building a single prototype. It was a network: government centres, private companies, universities, test ranges, wind tunnels, engine stands and flight decks, connected by contracts, schedules, and shared purpose. Such a network can be slow to turn and hard to steer. But when it aligns, it can carry a technology from whisper to standard practice. The ACE program in this sense becomes a case study in organisational capability as a driver of innovation, proof that creativity can live within systems and that courage can be collective. It encompassed not just the various NASA centres, but also included a web of industrial contracts that made it far more complex than the research laboratory of a single industrial firm. Even with all its layers of forms, committees and reporting lines, the ACE initiative proved that a machine made of institutions can still move quickly when the national mood is urgent and the purpose is clear. It answered the fuel shock not with slogans, but with prototypes and flight tests, with materials that weighed less and engines that breathed smarter. Yet there was an irony at the heart of this progress. NASA could create room for boldness, protect the unconventional, fund the fragile idea long enough for it to stand, but the technologies that ultimately reached airline service tended to be the safer, steadier ones. The farther a concept strayed from familiar practice, the slimmer its chances once oil prices softened and the panic subsided. That is why two of the most daring and promising lines of work, the advanced turboprop at Lewis and the Laminar flow control campaign at Langley, could both prove their technical soundness in NASA's hands and still fail to gain a foothold in commercial fleets. They saved the most fuel on paper and in test flights, and they were exactly the kinds of answers a crisis summons. But when the 1970s emergency eased and the price of fuel dropped, industry interest cooled. What had looked essential in lean times was judged expendable in plenty. There is another frame in which to read ACE as the pivot between one era of American civil aviation and the next, when a nearly unchallenged US lead in the global market met a coordinated foreign competitor willing to invest as a bloc. From the beginning, aviation was not the automobile story repeated at altitude. The United States government treated aircraft as a matter of national defense and strategic advantage. During the Second World War, Washington did not merely regulate, it bought airplanes by the thousands from private firms, and then, in the Cold War years that followed, poured billions into new aeronautical technologies that strengthened both military and commercial fleets. The results were dramatic. For decades, American manufacturers held close to 90% of the worldwide market. Boeing, the standard bearer, became the nation's largest exporter, and the health of the aircraft order book rippled outward through the whole economy. Robert Leonard, who managed ACE work at Langley, liked to make the point vivid. A single US-built jumbo jet sold abroad, he said, could offset the import of roughly 9,000 cars. The arithmetic of trade balance could be written in wingspans. But dominance invites challengers, and by the late 1960s, one took shape across the Atlantic. Airbus, a European consortium designed from the start to be more than the sum of its parts. Founded in 1965 and sustained by a mix of government backing and private investment, it built airplanes as a continental collaboration. British factories fashioned wings. French facilities assembled cockpits and final frames. Spanish teams crafted tail surfaces. West German plants produced fuselage sections. Belgium supplied edge flaps. American firms even provided engines. Airbus also introduced choices that signalled a willingness to rethink assumptions. 2 engines instead of 3 on certain models. 2 pilots instead of 3 in the cockpit. Those decisions were not just aesthetic, they lowered fuel burn and brought down operating costs per flight. By 1988, Airbus had captured 23% of the world market, and in 1999, it logged more orders than Boeing for the first time. The ACE story belongs in this wider scene because the technologies NASA matured, and the ones industry chose to pass over, shaped how American manufacturers met or failed to meet the new competition. Some observers even argue that the cautious habits that helped US civil aviation hold the lead for so long eventually handed an opening to rivals. And the pattern has not frozen. Today, both Airbus and Boeing face fresh contenders in Japan and China, countries building not only airplanes, but the industrial ecosystems to sustain them. Within NASA itself, AC was more than just one box on an organizational chart. It became the centerpiece of the agency's work in civil aeronautics at a time when public attention tilted towards shuttles and satellites. The superlatives people used to describe it were not modest. In the 1970s and 1980s, some called ACE the most important aeronautical technology program in NASA's portfolio. Others, measuring impact rather than publicity, said it was simply the best aeronautics effort of the previous decade. Recognition came not only in warm adjectives, but in formal honours. The Advanced Turboprop effort, though it did not enter airline service, earned a Collier Trophy, the United States' most prestigious award in aerospace, reserved for achievements that move the field forward in ways peers can measure. For a sense of why leaders spoke so highly of ACE, one can listen to Raymond Colliday, who later served as president of Lockheed Martin and had earlier been both DARPA's director and a NASA associate administrator. By most any metric, he said, yes, ACE mattered most. What made the difference, in his account, was not a single dramatic flight, but the program's scope and discipline. It gathered a wide array of research and technology development efforts under one banner that addressed a clear national need, and it carried enough resources to push them from sketches toward practical maturity. Too many aeronautics initiatives, Colliday noted, suffer from a lack of critical mass, never quite enough money, time or will to close the last gap between a promising idea and a tool the industry relies on. ACE, he argued, did not make that mistake. To place ACE within the agency's broader work, imagine a snapshot taken in 1983, the midpoint of the program and NASA's 25th anniversary. A dozen mainline aeronautics projects filled the frame, programs that pushed at different edges of the flight envelope. Supersonic Cruise Aircraft Research, or SCAR, continued the long-term exploration of how to build civil transports that could break the sound barrier efficiently, carrying more people farther with less fuel and less weight. The terminal configured vehicle studies looked down from the sky into the messier, more human layer of aviation. How to land safely in foul weather, manage dense traffic, quiet engine noise, and move large numbers of aircraft into and out of crowded metropolitan airports. Wingless lifting bodies investigated the idea that shape alone, without traditional wings, could generate enough lift to make new kinds of flight practical. Oblique wings, strange to the eye at first glance, tested the notion that a wing that could pivot up to 60 degrees relative to the fuselage might trim drag and save fuel at certain speeds. The Highly Maneuverable Aircraft Technology Program, or HIMAT, run with the Air Force, used unmanned demonstrators to try out technologies that could make future fighters both agile and efficient in the transonic regime. A forward-swept wing experiment, in partnership with DARPA, explored what would happen when the wings angled not back but forward 30 degrees, an unorthodox geometry that promised better handling near the speed of sound and improved low-speed performance. Other efforts focused on the environmental footprint and neighbourhood friendliness of aviation. The quiet, clean, short-haul experimental engine sought lower noise and fewer emissions for the kinds of airplanes that hop between close-in airports. The quiet, clean General Aviation turbofan engine did the same for business jets, where noise regulations and public tolerance were tightening. On the airframe side, the quiet short-haul research aircraft served as a flying testbed for techniques that might one day ease congestion by allowing planes to take off and land in shorter distances, using steeper approaches and quieter profiles. In rotorcraft, NASA pursued multiple paths at once. Vertical short takeoff and landing work supported helicopter technologies in general. The Rotor Systems Research Aircraft, an unusual hybrid, added wings to a rotorcraft to test how best to mix airplane and helicopter capabilities. And the Tilt Rotor Research Aircraft showed that, by rotating its engines and propellers, a machine could lift off like a helicopter and then fly twice as fast in forward flight, opening possibilities for both military missions and civil routes. These were impressive in their own right, but RCE overlaid them with 6 additional programs devoted specifically to fuel savings and efficiency. It was the keystone in a busy arch, and it was frequently described, sometimes admiringly, sometimes with a hint of lament, as the Apollo of aeronautics. The phrase compresses a great deal. On one hand, it signals importance by tying ACE to the most visible technological triumph in NASA's history. On the other, it reveals the uneasy fact that aeronautics, the agency's first mandate, often lived in the shadow of spaceflight's glamour. The wording has a particular provenance. In 1973, President Richard Nixon announced Project Independence, a national push to free the United States from reliance on foreign energy by 1980. Abe Silverstein, a former director at Lewis and the man who had coined the name Apollo for the moon missions, wrote to NASA Administrator George Low, arguing that the nation now needed Apollo-type programs aimed at energy, efficiency, and conservation. The label stuck, not only because it was memorable, but because it captured a yearning that the same focus and national will that carried astronauts to the Sea of Tranquility could now be turned toward the more earthbound task of saving fuel. The association with Apollo had a prehistory too. In the early 1970s, before AC took its final shape, an advanced transport technology program had bundled together several forward-looking aeronautical ideas, and the writer Jeffrey Ethel referred to it as an Apollo program for aviation. The comparison flattered, but also exposed a vulnerability. If the best way to explain the crown jewel of aeronautics was to borrow prestige from a space narrative, then the core identity of NASA's first A was at risk. The risk was not only rhetorical. A few years into ACE's run, as the 1980s opened, the new Reagan administration weighed whether NASA should keep aeronautics at all. Inside the agency, advocates scrambled to make the case, not in generalities, but in specific demonstrations of expertise and national benefit to the Office of Management and Budget and congressional staff. The rescue succeeded, but not completely. In 1980, NASA's total budget stood at about $3.6 billion, with aeronautics accounting for roughly $300 million, a small slice that made every dollar of progress hard-won. The pressure on aeronautics did not vanish with that year's appropriation. It remains a recurring theme. Seen from another angle, ACE resembles Apollo only in its seriousness and in its alignment with a national need. The differences matter. Apollo was a program to build and fly spacecraft, an end-to-end development effort with a hard deadline and a geopolitical rival in full view. ACE had no mandate to put a NASA-made airliner into service. Its mission was to build enabling technologies that commercial manufacturers could adopt at their own cost and on their own schedules. Where Apollo was driven by the urgency of national security and the drama of Cold War competition, ACE responded to an economic threat a slow bleeding of capability and competitiveness if fuel costs stayed high and the fleet remained inefficient. The scales were different as well. Apollo consumed billions. ACE, taken together across its 6 tracks, never reached even $500 million. And yet the analogy persists because, for Aeronautics, the program represented the same kind of focal point, a proof that NASA's research culture could deliver improvements with consequences far beyond a single lab or airport. Apollo endures in American speech as shorthand for what is possible. "If we can put a man on the moon," is how the sentence usually starts, before it turns to whatever ambitious goal the speaker has in mind. Flying itself, astonishing when it was new, has become an everyday miracle so common that its wonder dims. In that environment, with budget cutters at the door and public attention elsewhere, the title "The Apollo of Aeronautics" carries a deliberate edge. It is a reminder that the first A in NASA has a history and a future worth defending, and that the tools developed under its banner quietly shape national life. Jobs and exports, safety and noise, how much a ticket costs, and how often a small city is connected to the world. If you find these unhurried journeys through aerospace history soothing and worthwhile, take a moment, without breaking the spell, to subscribe to and like Space Historian. It helps keep these calm explorations coming. From a vantage point in the 21st century, the ACE narrative also rings with renewed relevance. Efficiency is again the watchword. Hybrid technologies, smarter materials, and careful control of flows and heat feel urgent, not optional. In the summer of 2008, gasoline prices once more climbed in dollars rather than cents, and a nation that had drifted through the 1990s in the comfortable haze of cheap fuel and big vehicles woke to find the bill come due. Without a coordinated effort to tie together government, industry, and universities around a common plan, the lessons of ACE grow more valuable, not less. It was a $500 million wager on the proposition that public investment could make flying meaningfully more efficient, and many of its goals were met. But the form matters as much as the numbers. ACE's structure, focused programs that matured base research and absorbed early risk on projects the private sector might avoid, offers a template. So does the warning embedded in its history. When oil prices fell after the 1970s shock, some of the most promising fuel-saving concepts were left on drawing boards and test stands rather than carried into fleets. The choice was understandable in the urgency of quarterly results. It was still short-sighted. Years later, NASA found itself trying to breathe life back into lines of work that had been shelved, including the advanced turboprop once thought safely buried. If AC is a model for how to respond when energy threatens national prosperity, it is also a case study in what happens when innovation is left to subsequent neglect.